Hello, and welcome to World of Lore, Dragon Age, Episode 1, the Tevinter Imperium. The Tevinter Imperium is the oldest human nation in Thedas. It covered nearly all of Thedas, and hardly anywhere on the continent remains untouched by the Imperium's long and bloody history. While still strong in modern times, the Imperium has become a shadow of its former glory. The history of the Imperium dates back to when the human tribes first arrived in Thedas. One of these tribes, the Neromenians, who settled along the coastline of the Nocean Sea, broke into four different kingdoms: Neromenian, Carinus, Tevinter, and Barandur. The kingdom of Tevinter was originally ruled by a dynasty of kings, and held its capital at Minrathous in the far north. Minrathous would soon grow Tevinter into a great and prosperous nation, due to its location as a great trade center. It was in the kingdom of Tevinter that something similar to the circles of magi would first be created, closed societies for mages to practice and study their abilities. From these societies, a council known as the Court of Magisters would be formed by the most talented of the mages. As the humans of the Neromenian kingdoms explored, they encountered the Elvan, or the Elves, who had inhabited Thedas for millennia before the arrival of the humans. At first, the Elves and the Neromenians traded willingly. However, the very presence of the mortals seemed to diminish the Elves as human illness and disease began drastically shortening the lifespan of the Elves. So, the Elvan began their isolation and began withdrawing to the confines of their Arlathan forest. As the Elves withdrew, the Neromenians expanded. In the year 1207 Ancient, the High King of Neromenian, a magister by the name of Darinius, would take the throne of Tevinter from his uncle, uniting the two kingdoms. By 1165 Ancient, Darinius would marry Queen Rithana of Carinus, joining his kingdom with hers. With the Neromenians all united under Tevinter, Darinius would create the Tevinter Imperium and would proclaim himself Archon. Darinius would establish the Magisterium as an official governing body, and it would not only contain the most talented of the mages, but the priesthood of the seven old gods as well. The old gods were the gods that the Tevinter worshipped before the advent of the Andrastian faith, and consisted of Dumat, the god of silence, Zazakil, the god of chaos, Toth, the god of fire, Andorol, the god of slaves, Urthemiel, the god of beauty, Razakil, the god of mystery, and Lusakan, the god of might. All of the old gods were depicted as dragons, and would go on to be corrupted by the Darkspawn and become the archdemons. The Magisterium would rule over the cities, handing down laws pertaining to magic and its use throughout the Imperium, thus solidifying the notion that those with magical power were proper leaders with a divine right to rule from the old gods. As the new Imperium grew, it grew eastward into the lands that the Elves had abandoned, and as the settlers reached the edge of the Arlathan forest, they began to encounter Elven scouts. The Imperium believed that these lands were uninhabited, as it had been more than 2 millennia since the Elves had withdrawn into the forest. Initially, the Imperium dismissed the claims of the settlers of non-humans in the area. However, when it realized that the claims of non-magic using humans were true, emissaries were sent into the forest. When the emissaries failed to return alive, a permanent watch would be established on the outskirts of the forest. In 998 Ancient, several Tevinter settlements would disappear into the forest, and tensions grew. By 981 Ancient, these tensions boiled over, and the Archon declared war against the Elves and marched into the Arlathan forest to lay siege to the Elven capital of Elvenon, allegedly with demons and dragon thralls by their side. 6 years after the siege had begun, Archon and the Magisters sank the city into the ground using blood magic to bring a swift end to the conflict. The Elven kingdom, which had lasted more than 2 millennia, was gone virtually overnight and its people enslaved. While the Elves were destroyed by the Imperium, the Dwarves received a much different treatment. In 1200 Ancient, Archon Darinius was the first human to successfully make an alliance with the dwarven kingdom of Kalsharak when he traveled there to treat with King Endrin's Stonehammer. When Darinius returned to Minrathous, he was accompanied by a body of dwarven representatives who would become known as the Ambassadoria. The Ambassadoria advises Tevinter leaders and manages the trade relations with the dwarves. All dwarves in the Imperium, even if their families have lived in Tevinter for generations, are not citizens of the Imperium. They are instead considered foreign dignitaries. All of Tevinter's major cities have dwarven embassies in them that are similar to dwarven enclaves elsewhere in Thedas. Some of these embassies, such as the ones in Minrathous, Neromenian, and Carinus, are entirely underground, so the dwarves who live there retain their caste even if their families have not lived at a Tig for generations. The biggest difference between the dwarves of Tevinter and those elsewhere in Thedas is that the dwarves in Tevinter have their own branch of government. This functions less as a parliament, however, and more like a lobby group. While Archon and the Imperial army besieged Elvenon, fellow humans belonging to the English tribes began to raid the Imperium's southern settlements. However, by 895 Ancient, the Imperium had claimed nearly all of northern Thedas and began conquering lands across the Waking Sea, settling the island of Estwatch in 880 Ancient. In 715 Ancient, the Imperium would launch campaigns to subjugate the Alamari and Avar tribes living in what is now Ferelden. It would take the Imperial army 4 attempts to get a foothold in the land, and in the far south, the outpost of Ostagar was established. Despite this veneer of control in the region, deployment to Ferelden and Ostagar was often seen as a slow form of execution, and anyone stationed there would not be expected to return, as the local Alamari, Avar, and Chasen tribes would often raid the Imperium's supply lines and harry patrols that were sent out. The Imperial Highway would eventually be commissioned to connect all lands controlled by the Imperium, and it would stretch from Minrathous in the north to Ostagar in the south. The Magisters believed that magic was a gift from the old gods, and they refused to recognize the mage underclass of elves and non-Tevinter humans. So when Archon Almadrius chose Tadarian, a lowborn mage of Planocene blood, as his apprentice, the resulting outrage from the Magisterium led to his assassination in 692 Ancient, and civil war broke out. The Civil War lasted for nearly 70 years, and for the first time since the fall of the Elves, mages fought mages. When the Civil War ended in 620 Ancient, Archon Parthenius finally admitted the lower class of mages, the Latans, to the temples and granted them 3 seats within the Magisterium. Between 575 to 555 Ancient, another large-scale civil war rocked the Imperium, as 2 of the most influential magisters vied for the Archon's empty throne. Though this conflict ended, it marked the end of Tevinter's Golden Age. Despite controlling most of Thedas, the magisters of the Imperium were not content with just ruling the mortal plane and seeked to conquer the Fade, the ever-changing realm of spirits and dreams. So in 395 Ancient, a group of magisters consisting of the 7 high priests of the old gods conducted rituals from the blood of hundreds of slaves and 2/3 of the Imperium's Lyrium to physically force their way into the Golden City, which lies within the Fade. Now, the Chantry claims that upon entering the Golden City, the sin of the Magisters stained it black, and that their touch rotted the city. So enraged was the Maker that he cast them from the Fade, twisting the 7 Magisters into the first Darkspawn. Soon after this, the First Blight began as the Darkspawn found the sleeping old god, Dumat, in a prison constructed by the Maker and corrupted him into the first Archdemon. The First Blight would ravage the Imperium for nearly 200 years, shattering its power. Tevinter would recall its armies from the provinces to defend the capital, Minrathous. Though the Blight would eventually be defeated and Dumat slain by the first Grey Wardens, civil unrest spread across the Imperium as it sought to reassert its control of the lands it had so willingly abandoned to the Darkspawn. The first stirrings of unrest came from what is now Antiva and Ravane, but after 2 centuries of battling Darkspawn, these uprisings were quickly quelled. Despite this, Imperial troops were spread thin and morale was low, and one Alamari tribe saw a great opportunity. The warlord Mafarath and his wife Andraste, a former slave, rose up in revolt and began what the Chantry would call the First Exalted March. This revolt spread like wildfire across the Imperium, and by 180 Ancient, they had brought an army from across the Waking Sea and into the Tevinter heartlands. The Alamari set out with 2 goals in mind: 1, to destroy the Imperium, and 2, to spread the word of their god, the Maker. They found much support in the Imperium's primarily elvish slave populations, and inspired many revolts to take place throughout the Imperium. As the Alamari under Mafarath marched north, it met the Imperial army at the Battle of Valerian Fields in 170 Ancient, and though the Imperial army suffered a crushing defeat, Mafarath perhaps realized that once the Imperium had a proper chance to regroup, that they would come crashing down on his army like a tidal wave, and so he struck a deal with the Archon Hessarian. The Chantry claims that Mafarath, jealous of the affection and popularity that his wife Andraste had amongst the people, exchanged her for the land south of the Waking Sea. Regardless whether or not this was the case, Andraste was burned alive by Hessarian, who in an act of mercy had her shot with an arrow before she was completely consumed by the flames. By 160 Ancient, Hessarian would convert to the faith of the Maker and forcibly converted the Imperium along with him. Many of the Magisters were violently overthrown in this time. 25 years after So when in 120 Ancient, when Ravain's War for Independence began, the Imperium dedicated the bulk of its force to trying to keep Ravain, giving up any ideas of reconquering the south and the free marches which had been gifted to Mafarath's sons. When cities in the eastern free marches rallied to help Ravain after the Battle of Temerin in 53 Ancient, the Imperium would finally be forced to give up its eastern territories. When Emperor Dracon I founded the Chantry in 3 Ancient and declared Divine Justinia I as the official head of the Andrastian faith in Divine One, it caused great consternation in Tevinter, which had been organizing the religion on its own terms for over a century. Though the Imperium would initially try to please the newly formed Chantry by reducing the Archon's authority over the faith and transferring that power to the Grand Clerics, relations between the two were strained from the very beginning. In Divine 5, the Second Blight began and officially scuttled any hopes the Imperial had of restoring its former glory, as many of the lands under its control were forced to be abandoned once more as the defense of Minrathous became the #1 priority. The Anderfels, one such region, would never forgive nor would it forget this, and by the time the Second Blight was over, Minrathous was all but sacked. The Imperium would remain unchallenged until Glory 80, when the Chantry of Orlais called an exalted march on Starkhaven, which had been under Tevinter control since Glory 45. Now, a slight divergence here to explain the timeline and calendar of Thedas. Each age after Ancient is 100 years, with Divine being 1, Glory 2, Towers 3, Black 4, Exalted 5, Steel 6, Storm 7, Blessed 8, and Dragon 9. In Towers 10, the Third Blight broke out in central Thedas, and the cities of Marnaspel and Varantium were besieged by the Darkspawn. With the aid of the Grey Wardens, and despite heavy losses, the sieges would be broken. The Grey Wardens then encouraged both Orlais and Tevinter to unite against the Darkspawn, but neither would aid the cities of the Free Marches. After 15 years, the armies of Orlais and Tevinter joined the Grey Wardens in making a stand at Hunterfell, where one of the bloodiest battles in history saw the defeat of Archdemon Toth and the end of the Blight. In Towers 87, a full-on schism would occur within the Chantry when the Imperium declared its own divine under a mage divine of Valhalla over the disagreements on the Maker's second commandment. Magic exists to serve man, and never to rule over him. The Black Age and the Exalted Age would see several exalted marches ordered against the Imperium to overthrow the Imperial Divine, known as the Black Divine. Between Black 40 and Exalted 10, 4 exalted marches would be called. They would only cease as the outbreak of the Fourth Blight in Exalted 12 required the attention of the nations of the South. In retaliation for the exalted marches, the Imperium would refuse to aid the South against the Darkspawn. Tevinter would go on unbothered until 30 Steel, when the Qunari arrived. By 42 Steel, much of the Imperium had been conquered and Minrathous put to siege. However, like every foe to siege the Imperial city, the Qunari were unable to breach its walls, and by 85 Steel, rebellion in the conquered lands drove the Qunari back. Determined to regain lost lands, the Imperial Chantry took part in the new exalted marches alongside the Orlesian Chantry. From Storm 25 to Storm 84, a total of 3 exalted marches were called against the Qunari. By Storm 84, adherents to the Orlesian Chantry had grown weary of fighting the Qunari, and so signed an armistice called the Lamari Accords with the Qunari. Tevinter, still hoping to regain lost lands, did not attend, and therefore remains at war with the Qunari, vying for dominance of northern Thedas with its new neighbor. The island of Saharon has been a particular focal point in the conflict throughout the centuries. Tevinter has 4 different social classes: the Altus, the Latans, the Soporati, and the Slaves. The Altus are the mages that are descendants of the original Magisters and High Priests of the 7 Old Gods. They make up the upper strata of Tevinter society. They are the historic rulers of the Imperium, though it should be noted that sometime after the Imperium's conversion, mages were banned from being a part of the government. This ban would be lifted in Storm 34 by Archon Nomarian, who was elected directly from the Circle of Magi. The Latans were mages who are born to families with no prior history of magic or families who had practiced magic for generations, but do not descend from the original Magisters or the High Priests. Latans are known to vie viciously for power, having to prove themselves over the established Altus class. 1/3 of the Archons have been Latans. Archon Tadarin was the first Latan to become Archon, and his ascension to the position caused so much outrage within the Magisterium that it caused the 70-year civil war mentioned earlier. Few outside of the Imperium understand the difference between the Altis and the Latans, leading to the common belief that all mages within Tevinter are magisters. After the Latans, you have the Soporati. The Soporati make up the bulk of Tevinter citizens, as these are your everyday folk who do not practice magic. Soporati, though more numerous than their mage nobility, have little to no say in the government. Those Soporati families that have a child that is gifted with magic become elevated to the Latan class, making magic a sought-after thing even among the commoners, unlike in the rest of Thedas. Finally, you have the slaves and Liberati. Liberati are slaves that have been freed from their master. They are, however, not citizens of the Imperium and have limited rights. They can, however, like Soporati, own property, become apprenticed in a craft, or have an apprentice. They can join a circle of magi or the Imperial Chantry, but however, they cannot serve in the Imperial Army. Slavery is not only legal in the Imperium, but is officially sanctioned. Slaves cannot own land or property, they cannot become an apprentice or have an apprentice, and are not allowed to serve in the army. Though historically slaves used to be primarily elves, it is now more or less an equal share of elves and humans. Dwarves and Kunari can also become slaves, as can mages. Slaves can only be freed in front of a judge with their owner present, or if their owner is deceased, they can be freed with a will saying that they are to be freed. The Imperium, as mentioned before, is ruled by an Archon, with its governing legislative body being the Magisterium. There are several ways to enter the Magisterium. The first, be chosen by one of the nation's 7 circles of magi. This choice is usually a senior enchanter, as the first enchanter is not eligible for the seat. 2. Become a Grand Cleric in the Imperial Chantry, as they each have a seat as does the Imperial Divine. 3. Inherit the seat from a relative, or a master from an apprenticeship. 4. Be appointed by the Archon, as the Archon reserves the right to appoint new magisters. Prior to the Black Age, the position of Archon was filled by a magister. However, that practice was banned in the Black Age, and members of the Imperial Chantry are also ineligible for that position. The position of Archon is an inherited title that can be given to family members or former apprentices. If an Archon dies before designating an heir, the Magisterium elects a new one. The Archon rules by divine right and has the last say on any laws passed in the Magisterium. Tevinter, due to its history of conquest, its role in starting the Blights, and the schism in the Chantry, is the most maligned and demonized nation in Thedas. Most Theodosians believe that Tevinter is an utterly corrupt and degenerate magocracy that must be feared until converted. It is hard to find writings from Tevinter outside of its borders that are not heavily altered or outright forged. Tevinter society is notoriously decadent, yet also takes great pride in their history and achievements. The Imperium not only treasures its past, but makes every effort to preserve it. I hope you enjoyed this first episode on the Dragon Age universe, and will follow the podcast and subscribe to the YouTube channel, as there is plenty of lore still to cover here in Thedas and in other fantasy and sci-fi universes as well. So thank you, and stay tuned for more.